So you should have a good definition of anatomy and a good definition of physiology, what the differences are between the two. Okay. The terms tissue, organ, molecule, organism, you should know what they mean. Okay. I'm going to ask you about metabolism and anabolism. So metabolism is
comprised. Can you repeat the terms again?
The second one here? I'm going to ask you a question about metabolism. So you need to know what anabolism is and catabolism is. We'll go over that. We want to talk about well, you should know the importance of the endocrine system and the nervous system, what they do together to run things. Review the fluids. So you should know what intracellular fluid is, as well as interstitial fluid. Look at the parts of a feedback system, both a positive feedback system and the more common negative feedback system. Know the parts of that, receptor, all that sort of thing. There's a look at the loops and look at the parts of it so you could answer a couple questions. And know the difference between a positive feedback loop and a negative feedback loop. So the parts of them and the difference between the two. And perhaps have an example of each one. They're both monitoring control conditions, but the difference between negative feedback loops and positive feedback loops are quite stark. Review your cavities. Cranial cavity, vertebral cavity, abdominal cavity, pelvic cavity, and then the smaller cavities like the pleural cavity, the peritoneal cavity, the pericardial cavity. So review your cavities, which we saw in the beginning of in chapter 1 there. So the question about this body part is in what cavity, that sort of thing. Revise the function of serous membrane structures. What is their main function? What does the serous fluid do? What is the purpose of these? And of course, know the various serous membrane structures, pleura, pericardium, peritoneum, that sort of thing. There'll be a question about the body planes and the anatomical position. So you want to know your mid-sagittal plane and what a parasagittal plane is, what a horizontal or transverse plane is, what a coronal plane is, all these different body planes, be familiar with them. There'll be directional term questions like medial, lateral, superficial, deep, proximal, distal. So be familiar with the directional terms. Such and such a body part is either proximal or is a distal to another body part because it's always something related to something else. So we review those. Know the anatomical names for various body parts, like head, cephalic, armpit, axillary region, that sort of thing. There may be some questions about that. There are a number of sentences that will have a couple of here's question 19 to give you an idea. Choose a directional term that would make the following sentence correct. The sternum is blank to and then another organ. Then it would give you blank the organ would be posterior, anterior, inferior, superior, lateral. So you have to be able to use these terms and in your mind's eye figure out these answers. And you want to know what organs are found in what cavities. There are a few of these situations where question 20, which of the following organs is not found in the abdominal cavity? Well, you have to know which ones are in the abdominal cavity to know which ones are not there. They'll give you an organ that's not there, and you need to identify it as being the wrong one. More serous membrane questions. Questions, so, pelvic, umbilical, sternal, odic, inguinal, carpal, digital, antebrachial, antegubertal, all these terms that you have like regular everyday terms for, you need to know what the scientific terms are. Head, back of the head, occipital region, that kind of thing. In review, I can't really tell you that. It's what I just said there. There's quite a few questions about knowing these body parts, the scientific names as opposed to the general names. Neck, cervical, pollex, big toe, hallux, that kind of stuff. Then I have diagrams here of a brain. And it's cut in different sections, and you have to identify what section is what. What body plane is that cut through? So there's actually a couple of those. Then when you talk about these membranes, for example, serous membranes, you have to know which one is the visceral layer and what is the parietal layer. Okay, there's a difference. Okay. So you probably know by now, visceral layers are attached to the organ, the parietal layer is up against surrounding structures or a wall of some sort. So they're asking you several questions about that. Take a look at, well, let's see what I think this is. Basic life processes. Here's a list of things here. Yeah, like metabolism, responsiveness, movement. There'd be questions about that. An example of something happening in your body would be an example of which one of those basic life processes. So you have to need to review those. There'd be a question about enzymes, what their functions are, how they work. You should know the difference between a synthesis reaction and a decomposition reaction.
What was that last one?
The difference between a synthesis reaction where you're making something and a decomposition reaction, which is taking things apart. Okay, that's a simple one. Some very basic questions about acid and base.
Professor, will you provide like an email on a list of what we need to know?
I'm doing that right now. Because I have I have like 6 different tests to pick out, and I just picked one, and so they're all a bit different. So I'm actually trying to give you a bit of a closer view of that, and I'm not going to make 6 different deals like that. Study line online there in the Canvas site, but it actually tells you just to learn everything. So I don't know how helpful that is to tell you to know everything. This is fairly specific. Take a look at glucose in the body and what that's used for. Also take a look at glycogen, which you use to store glucose in some organs. Notice between a saturated fat and an unsaturated fat. Review a triglyceride, its general function, where you find it, what we use it for. As far as proteins, take a look at the 4 structures. There's a primary, secondary, tertiary, quaternary structure or form of proteins. Take a look at those. Another question about enzymes. Actually, question 43, which of the following is not a property of an enzyme? So you have to know what enzymes do. Be able to answer that question of what it does not do. Take a look at what we use RNA for. We went over that. And any questions about ATP? What that's used for? Okay. Review the lipid bilayer of a cell. What makes it? There are 3 main components of a lipid bilayer. You know, the plasma membrane is we have in every cell in our body. Take a look at phospholipids and take a look at what parts are polar and what parts are non-polar. There's a term we use for that, amphipathic. Take a look at that. And take a look at that fluid mosaic model lip bilayer. Some structures are on the surface, some go all the way through, and they have names for those proteins that go all the way through, and those are just the surface, for example. And self-identity markers are on the surface. Take a look at that. So there'll be some questions about these particles which are within that lipid bilayer, which make it what we call the fluid mosaic model. Okay. Review that term selectively permeable, which is a big ticket term for our lipid bilayer.
Professor,
Yes.
is selectively permeable and semi-permeable just interchangeably used?
No. No, not exactly. They're close, but not exactly. Selectively permeable means a cell can select what it wants to let in, what it wants to let out. The other term means it's not necessarily selective, but it is a partial barrier to particles. So they aren't exactly the same thing, no.
Okay, thank you.
Well, selectively permeable would be the term used for the characteristic of our lipid bilayer. So lipid bilayer, plasma membrane, they're the same thing. You all hopefully know that. And cell membrane, those are all the same thing. There'll be questions about diffusion. So take a look at what affects the process of diffusion, which is a passive process. There are a number of factors. Your book talks about that. We talked briefly about cells. If they're put in some solutions, they could expand and burst. Other solutions, they'll be okay. Other solutions, they'll shrink up or crenate. And that has to do with the tonicity or particles per volume. Review that concept, if you would. And so osmosis, review that. Active transport, secondary active transport, simple diffusion. You should know what those all mean. And which ones require energy, which ones do not require energy.
I have a question. How many questions will there be on the exam?
About 100.
Okay, thank you.
I think in this one, I have 90, and then I've got an essay worth 10 points. So it comes up to about 100 points. Most of them
Would it be multiple choice or?
pretty much everything here. Yep. Some of my tests have multiple choice. This is all multiple choice. Some have part of that. They have a bunch of true false. Some have fill-ins. I have kind of a variety of tests that I give because they test well in the same fashion. So it kind of gives some variation. For some people can shine a little better. If you're an A student, you probably do good in everything because you're an A student. But this gives some variation for people who excel in one area that maybe have a chance to.
Okay.
Could I ask what the essay is going to be on?
Yeah, the essay is going to be on epithelial tissue. So I would review shapes, layers, names, features of them, that kind of thing. And usually I just want to, 4, 5, 6 line paragraph. It's not huge. It just answers what it says. It doesn't have to be excessively wordy or, one sentence isn't going to work, but just describe answer the question would be good. But review epithelial tissues, what they're used for, how they're arranged, shapes, layers, how we name them according to that, parts of them, how they make up membranes, be very familiar with epithelial tissue. There'll be some questions about, primary active transport, secondary active transport, facilitated diffusion, and passive diffusion, and osmosis. Know what those mean. Okay. And then there's questions like, if you recall, water is drawn from a position of high concentration of water to a low concentration of water to reach an equilibrium. So water will be drawn into a cell by the particles in the cell. If the particles can't leave, then the water is going to come in. the cell can burst. So there'll be questions that are going to ask you about what happens is excess water inside a cell or outside a cell, or a lack of excess, or too many particles outside of a cell, how these factors affect the cell. Our body goes out of its way to make sure the particles per volume are about 300 milliosmoles everywhere. So there's no net movement in or out of a cell, so they don't swell up and burst, they don't shrink up and crenate. So there'll be some question about if this type of solution is outside the cell, how's the cell going to respond to that? A review of phagocytosis and the extension of the pseudopods, how a phagocyte will engulf a microbe and bring it in. There are a number of questions about organelles and parts. So it'll describe an organelle having a particular function or shape or both. You have to pick out which one it is. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So there's several questions. So you have to identify whether it's are they talking about a Golgi complex? Are they talking about a peroxisome or a proteasome? Are they talking about histone bodies, which aren't true organelles, but they're involved in the DNA separation? Or are they talking about the mitochondria? Are they talking about linkers, which help to hold the plasma membrane in shape, the cytoskeleton in shape? So there'd be a number of questions. So you should know these organelles we've talked about and their basic functions, and then you'll have no trouble answering these questions. There'll be questions about mitosis and the various phases. So know your interphase, prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase, that sort of thing. Review again solutions, and there's a nice diagram in your book which shows what happens to a red blood cell if it's in a hypertonic solution, hypotonic, or isotonic solution. And be prepared to ask, well, why don't we put just plain water inside a person in an IV? So you should be able to know why we don't. Terms like phagocytosis, simple diffusion, osmosis, transcytosis, secondary after transport, you should know what all those mean. There's a definition of all of those. Okay, now, adding always binds with thymine and guanine with cytosine, ATGC. Adding with thymine and guanine with cytosine. Bear that in mind. ATGC. And then look in RNA and look at what replaces where uracil is found. I'll give you that part, where uracil is found. Because they're going to ask you to match some base triplets. Kind of give it away, but it's a bit of a brain teaser. Adding will always bind with thymine, guanine with cytosine, except we find uracil substitutes a base. You have to figure out what I'm not going to give it to you. In RNA that we don't find in DNA. So take a look at that. Know the basic 4 tissues in the human body. So you know which one it is not, because it's question 76 basically says which one is not one of the main tissue types found in the body. You have to know what 4 categories of tissues we have to be able to answer that. Review the different types of cell junctions. Some allow for connections, some allow for hold things together in regular situations, some allow for communication, some prevent toxic materials from leaking in, some are really good for there's a lot of tension. So review the different types of cell junctions with respect to epithelial cells. Review the basement membrane and what it is composed of. Remember, the basement membrane is composed of 2 parts, one part made by the cell, one part by the underlying connective tissue, take a review of that. Review the skin. Know what kind of epithelial tissue is found in what area. Okay. You know throughout the GI tract, except for the esophagus, it's simple columnar. The respiratory tract is also simple columnar, but they look stratified, so it's pseudostratified columnar, ciliated. So you need to, there'd be some questions about being able to know what type of epithelium is found in what body parts. Review transitional epithelium, where you might find that. We talked about exocrine glands, the glands that deliver their product onto an apical or free surface, as opposed to endocrine glands, which put their product, their hormone, in interstitial fluid. So take a look at how we classify exocrine glands. Functional classification of exocrine glands is based on what? That's the question. Question 83. Functional classification of exocrine glands is based on, it gives you a series of potential answers. E is all of the above, by the way, but you'll see that. There'll be a question about extracellular matrix of connective tissue. We talked about that many times. Connective tissue made up of cells and extracellular matrix. Extracellular matrix is made up of two other things, if you recall. Okay, I mentioned that answer tonight already. Okay, I mentioned that answer tonight already also.
Professor,
Yes.
is there a chapter we should focus on mainly?
This is a smattering of all that we've done so far, actually. There's a little bit of everything in here. Yeah. Just take a look back through all the chapters of what we're covering here tonight on this review. There'll be questions about symphyses and the type of tissue found in symphyses joints in the middle of the body. So review pubic symphysis and the discs of the vertebrae. There'll be a question about the compact bone and spongy bone. Remember, blood is liquid connective tissue, so it has cells and extracellular matrix. Review that. And then be able to answer a question about epithelial tissue, shapes, layers, where you find them, that kind of thing. And that's going to be your test. So it's a reasonable cross-section of things we've gone over. So hone in on those, you should do well. So with that, I think we're going to take our evening break. We'll come back with it's about 6:45, 6:46. So we'll come back at 7:30. Gives you 45 minutes or so to have something to eat. I'll come back and we're going to go over Canvas.